All of creation, in one way or another, bears characteristics of God. And not simply does creation have features that demonstrate its creator, but is sustained and held together continuously by Him. All of creation, however, of all of it, we are the ones who relate to God. We're made specifically in His likeness, and then He takes on the flesh of humanity in the incarnation of Jesus. He doesn't just relate to us, but He relates to us as a way to connect. It's this connection that we are made for. Yet much of the time, we feel a deep-rooted insecurity of this connection, its validity, its strength, its endurance. That insecurity has caused a pressure that would leave us disfigured. To bring us into completion, to truly express our likeness to Him and experience the full connection, this is what we must resolve to do. Nothing more than to be so deeply convinced of His love for us that nothing else could shape us. My name's Garrett. Join me today as we go beyond the veil. Welcome back to Beyond the Veil. This is a podcast where we discuss the spiritual reality of a God that's fully available and fully accessible. And we discuss what that looks like. And so we do a season format. We usually do, we're looking to do about 10 episodes a season or so when we break down a general theme for the season. And this season's theme is recovering the face. And so what I mean by that is this idea of the face of God, to be before Him, to be in His presence. It's a reality that was given to us by way of Jesus. And it's a reality that in many ways we've conceded or forfeited or not realized that it's actually right there in front of us. And so we want to recover this reality. And so last week we discussed moving from an investigator to an adventurer. So these are almost like archetypes to be divided into. The investigator, he approaches what he does not know with uncertainty, while the adventurer approaches what he does not know with curiosity. The first will lead you to trying to get everything right and always being wrong. The other will lead you to simply looking for connection and being an adventurer. That is the posture in which we can approach God for the embrace. And so that's what we talked about last week. This week, we're looking at the pressure to conform. And as we look at the pressure to conform, we'll look at what it looks like to transition into the freedom to become. So if you're like me, you're probably feeling some pressure in your life, especially in your walk of faith. So my aim here today is to free you of the burden of being someone you were never made to be, to empower you to become all that God sees you as. This is imperative for us to grasp. It's necessary, especially for connection, because if we don't understand who we are to God, then we'll always live as a different person. If we live as a different person, we'll never be able to fully connect. That applies to our relationships with others, but it is of the utmost importance in our relationship with God. So why is the pressure to conform the undoing of connection? Because you can't connect to a person who doesn't exist. A false version of you is not a real person. Even more so, we are made in His image, closer than any other element of creation, with characteristics that allow us to enter into the exchange with God. My aim here today is to free you of that burden of being someone you're never made to be, and to empower you to be all that He sees you as. We'll go over some of those pressures. We'll talk about the origin of them, and then we'll move towards what it looks like to have the freedom to become. So let's get into it. We acknowledge there are some pressures to conform. Here's what Paul has to say about that. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. He says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. I think there's a lot of depth to that, and you can apply it to a variety of messages. But the imperative part here we're going to start with is the conformity to patterns. And so there's elements in the world that we fall back to, that we have our base at, and they're not great. They are the patterns of coping. And so the first pressure we're going to want to look at is the pressure to perform. And before we get in there, I just want to say these are not an exhaustive list of pressures and patterns of the world. This is not necessarily a scripture you're going to find and be able to back it up with, but it is just kind of what I've noticed that I think are good examples. And so maybe these apply to you, maybe they don't, but use it more so as an example to see what kind of pressures you might be facing in your life. And so the first one, the pressure to perform. This is what one of my favorite teachers, Damon Thompson, says. He says, religion has one message: try harder. Religion has one message: try harder. But I'd add to that statement, religion has one message: you're not good enough, try harder. The irony is that you believe so deeply that you're not good enough that it doesn't matter how hard you try, because it's just the efforts of a fraud who doesn't have what it takes. So what is performance? It's the attempt to secure your value from your efforts. What often looks like seeking validation from others, it's really the attempt to secure yourself, to secure your value. And we can put it into the spirit of value, but also what it could really be is we just don't think that we are worthy, or that we have what it takes, or that we're there. And so we're always trying to get somewhere that we think we're not. It's always the grasp. It's always the striving. It's always the trying to get somewhere. It's performance. It's to go from here to there and to work your way there. And so what does it feel like to have the pressure to perform? It's weighty. It's stressful. In big situations, you might feel incredible stress. In small situations, you might feel stress that you really shouldn't have in all logical manner. And yet you feel like you have to do more and more and more. And even when you feel like you've probably hit the target, you always feel like you could have done better. It's this notion that you're not there, and you're not good enough to get there. And so you can try as hard as you want, but you'll never get there. So that's one of the pressures we have that's conforming us to an image. And we could move on to some more pressures. The pressure to project is another one. Have you ever heard the best defense is a good offense? You can apply it to sports and war and all kinds of things, but it's not always right. It's certainly a strategy when facing an adversary, but it's really a revealer of our own weakness. You see, we project our insecurities onto others to protect ourselves. The best defense is a good offense. If they can't get to me, they'll never know. And so it's actually stabilizing our interior chaos. So the pressure to project is an internal one meant to secure itself by controlling the postures of others. You might have heard that a rising tide raises all ships, but in a reversal of the same statement, a sinking tide sinks all ships. So if we can get people down to our levels, then we'll raise up. Then we can be where they're at. You might see it with shame. So people that feel a lot of shame, they cast their shame onto others. They make other people feel shameful. People that are angry, they're really in a deep pain and they're suffering, and it comes out as anger to defend themselves. And what it does is it causes more anger to come out of other people because you've wounded them. It's projecting. So the pressure to project is a revealer of this, that I'm out of control, that I can't control myself. So I have to find somewhere else to get my internal stability. You're using others to secure yourself. What does this do to our relationships? It alienates people, pushes them away, and it messes with our minds to how to see people, because now we're trying to get everyone to fit an image so that we feel better about ourselves. The final pressure I want to look at really quickly is the pressure to pretend. I remember a time in my life when I was struggling and I would try to hide that. People would ask how I was doing, and I would say that I was great, when in reality, I felt a deep anxiety that I couldn't explain. I was hiding, I was pretending. The pressure to pretend is to act as if things aren't as they are in order to hide our insecurity. Pretending is actually hiding behind a facade. Maybe you're exhausted all the time because it's a lot of work to be someone you're not. Maybe you're exhausted all the time because it's a lot of work to be someone you're not. The central belief of the pretending mindset is this: the real you isn't the right you. It's inauthentic and painful because people can't connect to you in this state. Some of us have done this for so long that when the reality of things is better than our imagination, we don't have the sensitivity to enter into what really is. God's not after this for us. We can live in what it actually is, and it might be painful sometimes, but what happens is we can begin to realize that God is better than what we really know. But if we hide, we'll never know. It's like Adam hiding in the garden, to never really see how good God is because he's too afraid of the pain, and so he has to pretend, he has to hide. These are some of the pressures we feel to conform to a different image. The pressure to perform, try to get somewhere that we don't think we are. The pressure to project, to try to get everyone else to our level because of our instability. And the pressure to pretend, to hide because we don't believe that the reality of things are as good as they ought to be. And there may be many other pressures you feel in your life, and you're probably thinking of them right now. And the truth of the pressures we feel is that these things are shaping our identity. We take these routes of pressure because of insecurity and trying to find the path of least resistance. It's a revealer where our deepest insecurities are, which results in us trying to self-secure. And it's left us trying to fit a mold that we do not fit. Because of our insecurity, we're trying to convince ourselves we're okay. And the truth of the matter is, as we feel pressure in our life, we have to go, something isn't right here. We're not okay. We need to do some serious looking into ourselves and why we feel this insecurity. And so as we undergo these pressures to conform, we take on a disfigured form, to the point that we begin to believe that this is our image. We face these pressures because of a simple principle. We're shaped by what we believe. When we believe we lack or we aren't enough, then we become disfigured by all the competing pressures to be shaped into what we believe we aren't. The pressure to conform is the pressure to be something you were never meant to be. It's a reimagining of our being, brought forth by the incongruent beliefs that have their origin in a single lie: that you are not like God, and thus you are incompatible with Him. This incompatibility means you're incapable of full connection with God. As we express ourselves to be anything other than compatible, we are expressing an image other than His. The question we must ask ourselves is, will we continue to believe the lie? Are we going to stay there? Or will we break from the ranks of the patterns of this world and be transformed by the renewal of our minds? We're going to move on to seeing where these patterns might have found their origin. They're patterns formulated by Adam, the first man, right? And so when Adam, the first of humanity, made in the likeness of God, heard the lie of the enemy that said, you are not like God. Can you imagine the pressure he felt, the anxiety, the insecurity, the uncertainty, that this relationship of the Creator and him walking in the garden, doing life, that it was actually beginning to have ripples of insecurity, because if he's not like God, if he's far off from God, if God's hiding or holding out from him, if God doesn't want to give him good things, well, now he's beginning to reimagine what God is like in this. And is God as good as he's supposed to be and what he says he is? And so Adam begins to believe the lie that he's not like God, and thus God is not who he says he is. And there's some insecurity in that relationship. And that's the lie I think we often begin to believe. It's an origin of these patterns for us. The greatest pressure on us is to be something we are not because we believed we aren't who God made us to be. When you're uncertain of who you are, you're left to your own imagination of who you ought to be. I'll just tell you straight up that your imagination can be a really beautiful thing. It can get you far. It can begin to open up a whole new world for you. But in the same way, it can be a weapon of destruction. It can lead you to reimagining what really is for a lesser thing. And I would give you a picture for you to kind of help you see this. The finger of God in Scripture represents his power, his movement, and his emphasis on things. So God puts his finger on us, and he places on us the call of our identity. But sometimes, rather than be directed by the finger of God, we often find ourselves under the thumb of the enemy. The enemy is the devil, of course, but sometimes we're our worst enemy. In Colossians, Paul writes, "Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior." Once you're alienated from God because of our behavior and what we were doing, and what did our behavior originate from? From a lie that says we weren't like him. And so we were convinced that God's our enemy because of this. And so this is the pattern we must break from. To be under the thumb of our own thinking and misunderstanding. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, makes a division of two humanities. One being the Adam humanity, and the other being the Jesus humanity. This is necessary for us to understand because Jesus is actually redefining what humanity was made for. And there's a lot to explain with the gospel. You can spend lifetimes going into. There's so many theories and ideas, and you can't really sum up all of it. But to simply say that one of the things that happens is Jesus redefines humanity. That walking in the flesh of humanity to show us what life looks like, to be completely in relationship with the Father, to never waver from it, to never break from it, to live life and life to the full despite all the anxieties and pressures of life. And so it's necessary for our being to look at ourselves from the standpoint of the Jesus humanity and not from the Adam humanity. We don't have to walk around believing a lie. And so we've looked at the pressures to conform, we looked at where it came from, but now it's necessary for us to enter into the freedom to become. And so you see, security moves us from the pressure to conform to the freedom to become. Security moves us from the pressure to conform to the freedom to become. We cannot enter into the face-to-face dynamic if we are not free. We can't entertain the presence of God if we're not free, if we're bound. And we cannot do it if we remain in a disfigured state. It's imperative that we see God as good. So good that we have the freedom to come to him because there's no darkness in him. We have nothing to fear. If we're afraid of God and what he's like, we'll never be able to approach him in freedom. But it's just as imperative that we see ourselves as he does. This is from Scripture, holy, blameless, and without blemish. It's how he sees us. And so security of relationship requires an assurance of his goodness and the belief that you are made for a relationship with him of nothing and nothing less. And there's so much more for what we're made for. We're made simply to be saved from hell and enter into heaven. Those are aspects to consider, but we were actually made to be compatible with God, to be like him, unlike all of creation, made in his image, made by his hands, not just by his breath. And so we were made to be able to connect with him in our compatibility. And I want to say that some of you might feel like you're incompatible with God, like you don't fit with him. But the truth is, you're precisely compatible. It's actually in you, deeply locked into you to experience permanent presence because of your compatibility. Of all creation, you are made for this. This is what you're born for. And so what do we need to know to move into this freedom to become? We have to begin to renew our minds. It's that second half of do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of our minds. We have to begin to repent, to change the way we think, to say this isn't what we've believed is actually inferior to the belief that God would have us have. If we begin to dismantle the lie that says we're not like God and say we're actually like God, more so than all of creation, more so than we ever believed we were, for the sake of compatibility, then we can go, it's time to be convinced of how much he actually loves us. It brings us into freedom to fully connect. Another thing Paul wrote is that we are predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. I know what you're thinking. I just did a whole segment about not being conformed. Here's the difference. You can look at being predestined to be conformed to his image more so as the budding potential and not this forceful thing that's happening to you. Not to conform to an image that isn't you, but to be transformed to the image of your unique expression of God. It's easy to become who you're made to be. This is the mature version of you. This is actually who you are right now, and we don't see it yet because of behavior and thought patterns that are blocking us from that potential. But today is the day to begin to renew our minds and to mature and to say, this is who we were born to be. Let us go into that. There's a unique expression of God in you that is available to be expressed today. And so what did we go over today? We went over the fact that there's some pressures in this world, some things that we have done out of pressure of insecurity. And some of those are we've performed. We've tried to get other places than we think we are. And we've projected. We've tried to put what we feel onto other people to bring them down to our level. And we've pretended. We've acted like things aren't as they are. We've been a different person. We've hid. And these are all pressures. These are things that we're feeling because of our insecurity inside of us. But I think today, as we looked at that these are all lies of Adam, that he believed, that he perpetuated, that he passed on, that it's time for us to go into our freedom to become, that we were made for more. We're being disfigured by all these pressures, pulling and tugging at us and shaping us, and you might feel it in you right now, that there is some real pain of that it's left you in a shape that you never wanted to be. And what it does is it builds on top of each other. The pressure builds on pressure, and it keeps conforming you to an image you're never made to be. But as we enter into freedom, we become precisely who we're made to be. Here's the final thought for you. Is there a pressure to be who you really are? No. It's the natural form we take on once we begin to remove the pressure to be something we are not. The greatest relief of your life is to be fully yourself. I believe the freest you will ever be is entirely yourself before God. When you trust God, you don't have to conform, but you become. The gap between who you functionally are and actually are is brought to a close. When we stand fully before him in assurance of his goodness, it's time to exit the pressure to conform our image to the pressures of lies and false identity and transition into the freedom to become all that God has made us to be. We have only one method to this end: to behold him and naturally become like him as we mature. So that was the pressure to conform versus the pressure, that was moving from the pressure to conform into the freedom to become. And so I think that topic was imperative for us to hit, because what it does is it allows us to engage in relationship as we realize who we are, we realize what we're made for. So thanks for listening, guys. Be sure to check out our Instagram. It's beyondtheveil_podcast. That's beyondtheveil_podcast. We have a YouTube version. If you're listening now and you like watching something, you can go watch it, and vice versa. If you prefer just to listen to it, we have Apple podcast, not iTunes. So you have Apple Podcast and Spotify as well if you like just to listen to it in the car. Be sure to check out those, and then Next week episode, we're going to be looking at how to see God in everything. So as we move into our identity, into being formed by Him, we can start to look outward and go, where is He in everything else? And that's going to help us enter into that face-to-face connection and recover the face. Be sure to share this with a friend if it impacted you, if it was valuable for you. We want to reach people with what we're doing here so that we can have a positive impact and transform lives. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week.